Hello there, this is Edgar Wright, writer and director of Baby Driver speaking. It's 9 o'clock in the morning in Hollywood, and I'm just having some coffee, and I'm just waking up, and I'm going to do my best to talk you through this incredibly dense movie. I did not direct Pegasus there. Somebody else did that. During the studio logos, you can hear the whine of the tinnitus. Tinnitus. Tinnitus in the US, tinnitus in the UK. One of the many pronunciation problems that I had through the shoot. I think by the end of doing this car movie, I really had it beaten into me that it was hood and trunk and not bonnet and boot. Hood and trunk, not bonnet and boot. If you say bonnet and boot to a US stunt team, they'll be very confused. But yeah, you heard there actually that there was the tinnitus like whine leading up to the start of John Spencer Blues Explosion. And that was something I did with Steve Price, the composer, who actually I had met, Oscar-winning composer Steve Price, who I had met like 10 years ago as a music editor, because I've had the idea for this movie for like 22 years. And I think I finally started to write it properly like 10 years ago in 2007. And one of the first things I did was break down all of the songs. Bell Bottoms by John Spencer Blues Explosion being one of them. And Steve Price was then not an Oscar-winning composer, he was a music editor, and I met him through Nick Angel, who was our old music supervisor on Hot Fuzz. And Steve Price basically broke down all the songs for me because I'm a big music fan. And music obviously inspired this movie, but I don't read music or play any instruments. So one of the ways I started writing this movie was to have all the songs broken down for me. And then the nice thing about it is that through that process, during the last 10 years, Steve then worked on Scott Pilgrim as a music editor and an arranger. Then he did half of the score for Attack the Block. And then he won an Oscar for Gravity. For his first full score. So when it came back to doing this movie, he was he had first refusal on doing the score because he'd worked on it like 10 years ago and he really wanted to do it. But, his score only makes up about 25 minutes of the movie, maybe. Most of it is songs, but we did these things where we did these little bridging moments between songs. So that whole opening is like a big string build to show you what Baby's hearing is like when music is not playing, but also as a way of bridging the different songs. So like I said, is 1995, I was 21, I was living in North London, I just finished doing my first movie, A Fistful of Fingers, and whilst I was editing that, I'd be listening to the John Spencer Blues Explosion album, Orange, on repeat. I think, and apologies to the Blues Explosion, I think I had copied an audio cassette of it. I've since bought about 5 copies over the years, so I've made it up to them in residuals. But I literally, the film sort of came to me in a dream, is that I would listen to this song and I would just visualize the action. And this is before I knew what the movie was about, before I knew it was about a getaway driver, or before I knew who the character of Baby was. I would listen to this specific song and imagine a car chase. So it's kind of overwhelming and amazing to me, 22 years later, or even 10 years after I started writing it, that the movie exists in the cinemas and on your TV screen, and not just in my head. And it's an amazing thing, and I feel very fortunate and grateful to have made this movie. It's also something that I, in terms of the initial inspirations, I mean, this scene pretty much says it all. It's the idea of music driving somebody, having a car movie where the lead character is driven by music, and excelling at his job through the rhythm of the music. It was something that was the key idea with this film. I always like music in films, and directors who use music really well, be it Quentin Tarantino or Martin Scorsese or John Landis. And, I'd use music a lot in my own films, and I really wanted to come up with something that was a diegetic musical, as in the sense, diegetic meaning that all of the music is playing within the scene. So apart from Steve Price's stuff, none of the songs are score. They're either on a jukebox or a stereo or in baby's ears or on the radio. So yeah, that was the idea for the movie, really. And then later, as I started to kind of formulate it over the years, it was I had the idea for the character and about this getaway driver who needed the right kind of music to be playing to sort of excel. And, you know, I'm very much like that in terms of I like to play music a lot of the time, and I use music to motivate me and inspire me. And, you know, when I'm driving, I'm always listening to music, and I'm always trying to sort of soundtrack my day, essentially. And, you know, I'm a big believer in music as a sort of motivator. And I like the idea of it becoming something that's like, it's, especially for somebody with tinnitus, stroke tinnitus, it is something that's a salve, you know. I actually used to get like tinnitus when I was a kid. Back then I never used to wear headphones. I never had a Walkman when I was a child. I didn't really start wearing headphones until the iPod came out. But I used to get attacks of tinnitus when I was young, and it was very painful. And then in doing research for this movie, I started reading up about it. And it was actually the Oliver Sacks book, Musicophilia, which gave me the idea for why he's listening to music the whole time, because there's some stuff in that book about people with tinnitus. And then in reading up about it, I read about some tinnitus sufferers using music to drown out the whine, and then that just gave me the brainwave. It's like, oh, that's it. That is why babies listen to music the whole time. It's a salve that's sort of turned into an obsession, you know? And this scene is interesting because, like, you've just had that big old car chase scene where you're seeing baby at work, and it's very deliberate that when he's with the rest of the gang, he's like a totem pole. And then when he's on his own, he's a bit more of a goof, at least at the start of the movie. Because Ansel, like, I think shooting here is, I think Ansel, like, was 21 when we shot this and maybe turned 22, like, on set. But, you know, the point of the movie, and in fact the title, is that he's like a young driver. And even his place within this crime universe is that he's an apprentice. You know, the film is essentially about an unpaid intern. And, you know, he's on the bubble as to whether he wants to be a part of the crime world or not. And the film really is about him understanding the moral implications of what he's doing and then being trapped in it and not able to get out. You know, so that's Ryan Hefferton's credit there, who was the choreographer on this movie. There was another thing that kind of, like, one of the inspirations for this came about is that I had loved doing scenes with choreography in my previous movies, and when I had done some music videos, I haven't done too many music videos. I've probably done less than 10 in my entire career. But in between the TV show Spaced and Shaun of the Dead, I did a couple of music videos, one of which was for a band called Mint Royale. It's a song called Blue Song, a music video that I did starring Noel Fielding from the BBC show The Mighty Boosh. And that video, which you see a little clip of later in the movie, was not the inspiration for this film, but I did, like, when I did that video in 2002, I basically, like, used my opening scene idea for Baby Driver within that video. And at the time that I did that, I had not done that because I had the idea for the video and then that became the movie. It was more like I'd already had the idea for the movie and I ran out of ideas of what to do in this music video. And then I was happy with the video, but I felt like I burned the idea. And I was very mad at myself because I hadn't, you know, I thought, I could have done a movie with this, and now I'd, like, done this music video, and then I'll never get a chance to do this movie. That turned out not to be the case. And one of the things that was actually a real benefit to getting this off the ground is that video that I did for Mint Royale with Noel Fielding kept coming back, because I shot it in 2002, and I guess Noel didn't get really super famous until like 5 years after that, and kept getting more and more famous. So that video just kept popping back up. And maybe about 10 years ago, I was doing a talk at the LA Film Festival with J.J. Abrams, who was interviewing me. And he specifically asked that one of the clips that we show was this Getaway Driver video that I did with Noel Fielding. So we were showing the video to the crowd, and during the video, JJ leant over to me and said, "Hey, this would make a great movie." And I leant back to him and said, "I am way ahead of you." Because at this point in 2007, I'd actually already taken an advance to write the movie for working title. Now, I would not recommend this to screenwriters out there, but I took the advance in 2007 and then delivered the script in 2011, 4 years later. So I wouldn't recommend anybody does that, because you could get into legal trouble. But it was also a measure of how complicated the movie was. I think it's after I finished Scott Pilgrim in 2010, I started writing Baby Driver, and it's the first solo script that I'd done since my first movie, since I was like 20 or 19 even. And, you know, it's a little different from the other movies because it's not specifically a comedy. It's more of a heist action movie. And so writing scenes on my own was a little, you know, it was just a lonelier process. I wrote the movie, the first draft of it, in Los Angeles. And my routine when I was writing on my own is I would have to get out of the house and go to like a coffee shop and read the LA Times and read all of the kind of crime stories, and watch documentaries about like sort of crime, and watch a lot of old film noirs. And then the other really crucial thing that I did, which ended up being a huge help to the movie, was I started doing interviews with ex-cons. It was important to me as a English middle class like guy that if I was going to make an American crime film, I'd better get the details right. So part of that was actually speaking to real ex-cons. Oh, the other crucial thing that I did is I wish I felt like I probably couldn't do the movie if I hadn't done this, is maybe also like 10 years ago, I had driven across the States. I had my Jack Kerouac moment and driven from New York to LA on my own. I've also done like sort of LA to Vancouver on my own as well, and I love driving in the States, and I love driving and music together, and you know, it's not something I do a lot of in London actually. I don't drive in London, I don't even have a car in London, but in the States I like the experience of being on the road and listening to music. It's one of my favourite things. But to go back to the ex-cons thing, the only other movie that I've done where I've had the opportunity to interview people has been Hot Fuzz, where we interviewed lots of cops. With this, you know, it's an interesting thing, is where you talk to like a producer and you say, how do we find ex-getaway drivers? And as it turned out, through a couple of researchers, Lucy Pardee and Colette Stansted, we found some ex-cons, some of whom had become writers, some of whom were just in rehabilitation programs and were happy to be interviewed. And so I think through the course of the movie, directly or indirectly, I spoke to probably about 6 ex-cons, several of whom had been getaway drivers or had been in crews with getaway drivers. A couple of them I interviewed in London, and the rest of them are all in the States. And there was one key person that Lucy Pardee, one of our researchers, found, a man called Joe Lawyer, who actually crops up later on as a security guard. So I spent time with him. First, I didn't let him read the script straight away. I'd already had like a rough first draft. The first thing I did was I talked to him about characters and scenes and scenarios, and just got his kind of thoughts on that. And it was an interesting thing meeting somebody from a completely different life. Joe Lawyer had been in the 80s and 90s had committed, I think, close to 30 or just over 30 armed robberies and had been in prison for, close to a decade. It's funny to meet somebody like that from a completely different walk of life and then realise that you're both like big film geeks. And literally the first thing he said to me, because you're always nervous meeting somebody that you like don't know and it's from a different world, and the first thing he said to me, he goes, "Hey man, big fan of Hot Fuzz. I know that film off by heart." So one of the things that was great about it is to meet somebody from that world and say, "Oh, this is my idea for the movie, and this is my idea for Baby, and this is my idea for Doc, and this kind of character." And eventually I became like sort of very comfortable with him to the point where I could let him read the whole script. And then he actually is credited at the end of the movie as script consultant or technical consultant. I can't remember which it is, but one of the two. And he is in the movie playing a security guard. But things like that are a huge benefit because, something that's coming completely from your brain, and having read a lot of like crime non-fiction and watched a lot of film noirs, you want to make sure that there's some kind of basis in fact as well. And I was very pleased that lots of the things that I had written, were not a million miles away from the truth. And there are some things in the film that I'll point out that are like straight anecdotes that I got from these interviews with ex-cons. Like even the thing of actually, I wrote the film for Los Angeles and then changed it to Atlanta once we knew we were going to be shooting in Georgia. And that was something that initially I was a bit reluctant to shoot it somewhere other than Los Angeles. But once we had decided that Atlanta was going to be the place, I just spent a lot more time in Atlanta looking at locations that I'd never previously been to. And then when I started doing that, it really started to open my eyes to the idea that actually maybe Atlanta was a better location for the film than LA. There's the Atlanta Journal-Constitution right there. So it's very important to me, without being heavy-handed about it, to make it kind of very specific to a place. And it seemed to make a bit more sense that if they were in the Southeast, that people talk about heading west, like California is always in life and in fiction is like a destination, somewhere to kind of head to, and this idea of this hallowed better place that's like sort of on the kind of on the coast. So I think for these characters it made more sense that they were in Atlanta and there's like the dream of going somewhere. Like even on the mural in that diner you've got the sort of Route 66 artwork. This diner, by the way, looks very authentic but is a set. It does not actually exist. So when people watching the movie they were going, "Oh, where's that diner?" And it was like Marcus Rowland's our brilliant production designer who I've worked with for nearly 20 years now. He made this. It was a shell of a building and he made a diner in it. And it's so authentic that, as you can imagine, when we were filming, lots of people came in and tried to sit down and have lunch in a set, basically. So yeah, the other thing like being in Atlanta is as soon as I started location scouting, I just noticed that there were like muscle cars everywhere, which isn't the case in Los Angeles, which is, Prius central. Like Los Angeles is a city of hybrids and electric cars, but Atlanta is very much still like muscle car central. Chargers, Challengers, Camaros, Mustangs, Trans Ams. So that made me think, oh yeah, this is the right place to be. And also, not only is Atlanta a big music city, amazing history of music. On a crime level, it's an interesting place because it is a travel hub of freeways and trains and planes, and thus is a gateway city in the drugs trade, which makes it sort of, that it has its own sort of like criminal problems. So that was interesting in terms of it is somewhere that people like sort of like, the criminals meet in, or there is like like I said, like a hub of like sort of crime. And actually reading up about it in like the sort of papers and on like sort of Atlanta sort of local news, there's a lot of bank robberies that are very similar to the one in the opening scene. This is CJ Jones, who's playing Joe, who is a real deaf actor. And in fact, for the part of Joe, which was written as a deaf African-American in his 80s, he was the only actor that we auditioned who was actually deaf. And as soon as I had auditioned him, and then I started auditioning other very good actors who were pretending to be deaf, it made me feel immediately uncomfortable. And I said to the casting director, I said, we really have to give it to CJ. So we saw him again and interviewed him, and it was a really magical experience for me and Ansel working with CJ, who is like one of the nicest actors I've ever worked with. But it's a fascinating thing and a very sort of humbling and inspiring thing to work with a performer who's deaf, because when you're working with somebody who has to lip read what you're saying, you're immediately aware that like 50% of what you say is utter guff and nonsense. And it really trains you to be a lot more succinct and direct with what you're saying, because as you can probably tell from this commentary, I say kinda, sorta, like, and when you're talking to somebody who's lip reading you, you become very aware that maybe you should get to the point quicker. But it was amazing. It was amazing working with CJ, and you know, I had like sort of, there was a lot of those scenes with CJ and Ansel were shot right at the very end of the shoot. You know, so we'd already done all of the action, and all of these guys had gone home, and we're sort of like, some of the final stuff was CJ Jones, who was just a treat to work with. Only Jamie Foxx could pull off that sweatshirt, I feel. I don't feel that I could actually, much as I love that playing card sweatshirt, I would love to be able to wear something like that. I feel like I just couldn't do it justice.
Who doesn't like hats?
When Jamie agreed to do the movie, I was, and Kevin, in fact, I mean, these two. I mean, look at this. Straight away, you've got a two-shot with two Oscar-winning actors in it, which is quite something. And every time we'd shoot a shot like this, I would whisper to Bill Pope, my DP, I'd say, oh, this is a double Oscar shot. You got two Oscar winners in the film. There is a third Oscar winner in this movie, and I'll point out who he is later, but you have to guess in the meantime. So yeah, Kevin Spacey and Jamie Foxx, I mean, part of an incredible ensemble. But I was so excited when they separately agreed to be in the movie. You know, say my dialogue. It's an amazing thing. And I think it brings real weight to the movie. And even, like, it was very important to me, especially in the casting of both of them, but like, I mean, I'm sure you're not watching this for the first time with a commentary on, and if you are, I don't know what's wrong with you. But if you've seen the movie, like, Jamie Foxx obviously dies at a sort of critical point in the movie, and the casting of a big star doing it, like, makes that even more shocking. Goes right back to the Janet Leigh death in Psycho. If you haven't seen Psycho before, I do apologize, I just spoiled it for you. Yeah, like the casting of these two, I like the idea of sometimes the casting of real stars, real A-listers, can give an unpredictability to the movie, because then when, you know, things play out in a different way, how these characters come in and out of the movie, it lends a sort of extra sort of unexpected excitement to it, because, you know, Kevin and Jamie are both leads, and so in this movie, though, they're like, everybody's part of a great ensemble, and I just love the idea that you're not really sure when they're going to show up next or what's going to happen, and I think actually their huge star quality really adds to that, and especially in terms of the way that the film plays out and their unpredictable deaths, you know. I always felt like that with, like, Quentin Tarantino is so great at doing that. Like, I remember I think I read the script of Django Unchained before he made it, although I was not the person who leaked it onto the internet. I'd just like to say that on record. But I remember reading that script, and when Leonardo DiCaprio's character dies 2/3 of the way through, again, if you haven't seen Django Unchained, I'm sorry. Maybe I should have put a warning at the start to watch the film Psycho and Django Unchained before we started the Baby Driver commentary. But Anyway, Leonardo DiCaprio dies, but he dies like about 45 minutes before the end of the movie. So I remember even when I read it, I was like, what? So, you know, I like the idea in this is like, you know, Jamie Foxx's character kind of does not make it to the end, and his death is obviously crucial in the third act. But having a big star just kind of helps that, because an audience that's watching it just assume that Jamie Foxx is going to be there until the end credits, and then when he disappears, it's like a real shocker. I love working with Jamie. I mean, I think Jamie's one of those actors who can just do anything, and somebody who has been a star since he was 21 and can do like, you know, comedy and drama and action and music, do it all like sort of equally well is quite astonishing. So I remember when they were doing this was actually a scene, speaking of which, I'm really selling this bit. So this scene with Flea, the amazing Flea from Red Hot Chili Peppers, of course, looking very much like Elijah Cook Jr. in this film, I think. This scene originally was written that it was 2 Michael Myers masks and 1 Austin Powers masks. And Mike Myers and Warner Brothers agreed to let us have the Austin Powers mask. But then when we were coming up towards shooting, the Halloween people, they hadn't said no, but they definitely hadn't said yes. And as it got closer to the shoot, I sort of had to come up with a plan B, because I had this feeling that we were never going to get a solid, like, affirmative from the Halloween team. And I understand that. The Halloween, sort of, their concern was, they said that the scene was funny and that they'd never let Michael Myers be the actual image be used in a comedic scene, which is fair enough. So I had to write a new version of the scene, and I had to run it past Mike Myers, who is extremely helpful with making this happen. So thank you, Mike. And he's seen the film and he really likes it, which means a lot to me because I'm a big fan. But I remember I was in Atlanta, I had to call Mike, and I said, hey, I need a plan B because we haven't got the Halloween masks cleared. And I said, my plan B is that there should be 3 Austin Powers masks. So he said, no, imagine this as well. I've been a fan of like Mike since I was a teenager. Imagine Mike Myers saying this to you. He goes, oh, that sounds great. I mean, like, have you written it? Why don't you read it to me on the phone? So imagine like having that dialogue and then having to read it to comic legend Mike Myers on the phone, which I did, and he said, that's funny. And then he told me the story, which was funny. He said he really liked the scene and he thought it was funny. And he said that when he had first worked on SNL, maybe when he first was on SNL in like 89 and got his first check, he went to the bank to cash his first check, and the check said Michael Myers. And the bank teller said, Michael Myers, are you going to stab me? So it made him laugh about like the first time he'd ever like got a check from SNL. Now there's an interesting thing, we'll probably talk about this action on a separate commentary, although I have to give a shout out to Darren Prescott, our second unit director, and Robert Nagel, one of our coordinators, and Jeremy Fry, the driver, and also Clay here, who's playing the Marine and driving this truck, is actually usually Jamie's stunt double. And also Mark Byers, our physical effects guy, responsible for kind of like the action on that freeway, which is just incredible. There's an interesting thing happening here, is that I had wanted to use Neat by The Damned. That was one of, probably before I started shooting, there were probably about 7 or 8 tracks that I had nailed down. It's like, this is the track and this is what's happening. Now, what we did with these scenes is that we did these animatics and did those storyboards for the whole scene and cut them to the music. And I remember Bill Pope said to me, when he watched the animatic, he said, the action that you've done for this scene is going to take longer than the song that you have, because this song was like 2 minutes long. So basically that shot you saw there of Ansel rewinding The Damned, I shot on the last day of the shoot, weeks after this bit, because we had run out of song. The action, Bill was right, the action was too long for the song, and I didn't really want to have a second song. So we'd shot the rest of the scene, and I thought, oh, I know. We get into the other car, Ansel plugs in the iPod and rewinds the song to the last chorus. Because that also speaks to the character, is that when everything's going perfectly, he's timed all of these like escapes to the music. But of course, this one does not go perfectly. Like, they get shot at by a member of the public, they get shot at by the security guards, they get rammed off the road. So his route has been completely messed up, and so he has to kind of improvise. So I like the idea that he rewinds the song, and that was something that I came up with, like, on one of the last days of the shoot. It's funny as well, I saw this documentary about the Damned, who are like a favourite punk band of mine. There's a documentary that they did a couple of years ago called I Bet You Wish We Were Dead, or something like that. And within the documentary, the lead singer Dave Vanian is at one point sort of being sort of jokingly bitter about their standing in culture. And I watched this documentary after I'd made the movie, and he said in the documentary, oh, nobody ever uses the Damned in movies or documentaries. You know, if they have a documentary about punk, they use the Sex Pistols and the Clash and the Buzzcocks, but they'll never use the Damned. And he literally says in the documentary, he goes, why hasn't anybody used the Damned in a movie? Why can't we be in a movie soundtrack? And I was lying in bed watching this documentary, and I literally sat up and I was like, yes! I was going, oh, hopefully he's gonna be so happy when he sees this. So the Damned have not seen the movie yet, but I intend to invite them to one of the premieres, and I hope they are happy with not only the use of neat, neat, neat like 1.5 times, but also we show the album cover on the iPod. So for all the members of the Damned, that one was for you. I hope you enjoy.
Oh, you looking for JD? International Man of Mystery?
This is a location, this set, actually. Doc's loft. There's no sets in the movie, really, apart from Baby's apartment. Baby's apartment was a set, and the diner was a set built within the shell of an old restaurant. But everything else on this movie was on location, which is not unchallenging.
This is it.
And also, if you've ever shot in Atlanta, Georgia, you know that maybe about every 10 minutes you hear a distant train. So you're always working around, because it's one of the major, like I said, one of the major travel hubs in America. So it's quite a calming, nostalgic sound. I do like hearing the sound of a train, but sometimes when you're filming, you can get stuck next to a extremely long and extremely slow-moving train, which might take 25 minutes to clear. So, you know, none of it's... Actually, some of it is in the movie. Actually, if you listen to some of the scenes for tension, especially in the tequila scene, you can hear a distant of trains. This flashback that we shot with Sky Ferrara, who is the amazing singer and actress, was shot as some of the first footage that we did of the entire shoot. We did it actually before the first day of the shoot. The first day of the shoot was the coffee run sequence when he's walking to the coffee shop and back. But this stuff we did before we started shooting, and shot it on 16mm, I think, and also I shot a lot of it with a hand-cranked camera, which is how they used to shoot silent movies. So it is exactly what you think it is. It's a lever that you're cranking by hand to keep the speed at 24 frames per second. However, obviously with a hand-cranking camera, you go faster if you want it to slow down, and you go slower if you want it to speed up. It is also really tiring. Like, I think a couple of times during that sort of those shots of Sky where she's singing, you know, singing the demo, I operated the hand crank, and like even just doing it for 3 minutes is a real workout. So I'm sure those guys, those camera operators back in the silent era, must have had like really like like strong wrists by the end of it. The use of Easy by the Commodores here is interesting because this wasn't in the original script, and the reason that it came about was when we were auditioning Ansel Elgort. I did one audition with him at Working Title, and then his second and final audition, in fact, was at Ryan Hefferton's studio at the Sweatshop, or is it the Sweat Stop? It's one of the two. It's in Silver Lake. And we did a little second audition there where we did some sort of physical movement and dance stuff. And it was actually Ryan's idea. We were having lunch before Ansel got there. And he said, you should just ask Ansel what song he knows off by heart and get him to, like, perform it. So it was not something that Ansel had been warned about or had had any chance to prep. But I asked Ansel point blank, I said, oh, is there a song that you know off by heart? And he said, yes, Easy by the Commodores. And I was like, huh, that's interesting. Because, you know, Ansel's 20, or he was 20 at that time. I think he hadn't, or maybe he'd just turned 21. And I thought that was an interesting thing that then eventually sort of like, you know, became key to the character, is that, you know, just because somebody's younger doesn't mean that they don't listen to older music. When I was a teenager, I almost exclusively listened to music that was from the 60s and 70s before I was born. And, you know, it's an interesting thing to me is that, like, Ansel listens to that song just because he loves the song without necessarily the context or any of the baggage of the band themselves or who the Commodores are or who Lionel Richie is. He just likes that song. And I said, oh, how did you find that song? And he said, oh, somebody gave it to me on a compilation and I loved it. And I thought that was an interesting thing, is that, like, I think Ansel's father is older than my father, so there is an interesting thing with him where some of his reference points are for somebody that's not of his age, because he's, like a lot of us do, grown up with his parents' record collection. And that was something I felt with Baby that was, like, an important thing, is that he sort of ends up listening to all music because he's inherited other people's record collections, like his parents' music. Joe, his foster father, like, you see that he has a lot of vinyl in his house, presumably from before he became deaf. He would have a music collection. There's those albums, and some of which are like Baby's as well. But then, if you notice in the earlier scene, when you first in Baby's apartment, you can see all of the listening devices on the side. And my thought was, if Baby is a character who's been stealing cars since he was a teenager, he is probably inherited a lot of other people's record collections, because if you steal a lot of cars, you're going to end up with a lot of chargers and iPods and sunglasses. And so that was my idea, is that, you know, actually in this scene coming up, he's got the pink and glittery iPod, which is clearly not his, and one that he has, like, found in a car after he's stolen it. So I thought that was an interesting thing, is if this character has listens to a lot of old music without necessarily having any of the context of the artist or who they are. You know, also, even this song came about organically because I was trying to find the name of a character where there were some good songs about them, and there was the T-Rex song called Deborah, and then Beck has a song called Deborah. There's also a third song by Dave Edmunds called Deborah. I didn't include that one. In fact, Quentin Tarantino told me about that one because he read the script and he said, oh, you know, there's another song by Dave Edmunds called Deborah. And I listened to the Dave Edmunds one. And in the Dave Edmunds song, the character is a complete bitch. And I thought, I don't know if I want to use this one because she sounds like a nasty person. Whereas in the Beck song and the T-Rex song, Deborah is definitely an object of love. And that was more important to the scene. So I thought, okay, so Ansel knows the T-Rex song, or Trex as he calls it. That's one of my favorite things in the movie, I gotta say. And it was something that I'll say that somebody at the studio asked me to cut it out because they didn't want Baby to seem dumb. And I said, I'm not cutting that out because to me that's utterly endearing. Is that, and people do this a lot, I do this all the time, and I'm sure there are other people out there that do this thing, where you never said things aloud, and sometimes you might say a band name aloud and pronounce it wrong. And if you're with somebody else who likes that band and you say, like, there's a band called Metronomy, but I always call them Metronomy. And then somebody said, oh, Metronomy? I said, oh, right, I thought it was Metronomy. So when Ansel says Trex and she says T-Rex and he looks utterly embarrassed, it's one of my favorite bits of his performance because it's so real. Because you would want to sound cool in front of this girl that you like, and then you, like, sort of say something dumb and then immediately embarrassed about it. Anyway. So Ansel likes, or Baby rather, likes the T-Rex Deborah. Like, Lily knows the Beck version of Beck song Deborah. But in this reality, neither of them know the Dave Edmunds song Deborah. That's my thinking. Quentin Tarantino knows it, but he's not in the movie. This now, okay, so that shot of the laundromats in the background, the washing machines, all of those colors going around. You might think that in a sort of a big Hollywood movie there might be some fancy way of getting all of those washing machines to run at the same time, but no. In between every take, the art department would run over to those washing machines and pump quarters into them, which is about as lo-fi and as low budget as it gets. I remember when we were on this location, I said to the production designer, I said, is there any way of getting all of these washing machines on the same switch so we could all, like, wire them up together so they all went at the same time? And Marcus said, let me look into it. And then he said, no, there isn't. We're just going to have to pump quarters into these machines. So it was a very interesting, funny image, which I don't know if anybody got this on the documentary. I was just seeing lots of art department people run over and pump, like, quarters into these washing machines. But it's a very striking image, I think. So this is something like, I like the idea that, because these two are falling in love, is that in a lot of the rest of the movie, there's like a lack of color. There's color in the costumes and in the cars and in some sort of objects like the clothes here. But a lot of the locations themselves are like very grey, deliberately concrete grey. And then, you know, and green. You get this in this apartment, and you get it in Doc's loft. Something about the shooting of Atlanta itself. I mean, anybody that's been to Atlanta or lives in that area knows that Atlanta is a very leafy city. There's some name for it. I keep forgetting what it is, like a sort of city of trees or something that people call it, or like a city in a forest. I can't remember. And if you live in Atlanta, Georgia, I apologize for not remembering, and please send the answers on a postcard. Oh, that was a clip of Mint Royale, the Blue Song video with Noel Fielding that I was talking about earlier. But there was something that was intentional, was that when we were location scouting, I said to our location scout, Doug Dresser, that I didn't want it to look leafy. I didn't want to shoot leafy Georgia. I didn't want to shoot leafy, woody Atlanta. Because especially with the chase scenes, I just felt, and our, you know, second unit director, stunt coordinator Darren Prescott said the same thing, as he said, well, when you see like a leafy freeway, it makes you think the characters have already got away. So actually for almost the entire running time of the movie, we shot specifically urban locations and built up areas in Atlanta, this being a rare exception to that. Of course I say that and then there's some trees immediately at this frat house. This was both the first day of the shoot and the last. We went back, there was the first day of the shoot, that frat house, and then we went, actually it was a pre-shoot scene, and then we went back and shot something else. But I had this thing talking about the locations. I was saying, whenever I saw the Georgia State, they'd always recommend these different freeways. Say, oh, we can close this freeway. There's always like the leafy one that was out in the middle of nowhere. And I just said to the location manager, I said, we have to be downtown Atlanta, otherwise the film doesn't work. Because when you see leafy freeways, you feel like they've gotten away already. That's what Darren Prescott said. He goes, it feels like they got away already. And I said to him, I said, oh, it's too much Smokey and the Bandit. It just looks like Smokey and the Bandit when we're out in the kind of like the country. And that's not the vibe that we're going for. It needs to be like a city. It needs to be urban and concrete. And then there's another Burt Reynolds film called Sharky's Machine, which Burt Reynolds directed. A really good thriller, like sort of like a gritty update of Laura. And that is all shot in downtown Atlanta and features that hotel, the West Inn hotel in Atlanta, very prominently. And that is very concretey, and it's obviously shot in 1981, and like a lot of the areas are a lot grittier. But I would say to Doug Dresser, that's Big Boy and Killer Mike there, doing a cameo, speaking with Spacey. Atlanta music royalty. Big Boy from Outkast and Killer Mike from Run the Jewels. Anyway, I'll finish the story. Doug Dresser, I would say to him, when we were talking about locations, I would say, more Sharky, less Smokey. More Sharky's Machine, less Smokey and the Bandit. And so that would be a mantra for the locations is, you know, more Sharky, less Smokey. And then at the end of the movie, we get a bit more into Smoking the Bandit, White Lightning territory when you actually see Leafy, Georgia. This was Kevin Spacey's first scene. And even though we had rehearsed it and we had done a whole table read-through, I remember watching Kevin do this dialogue and having an out-of-body experience where I was no longer the writer-director of Baby Driver, but I was like an audience member and a Kevin Spacey fan, sort of just marveling at him. And then I just had this moment where I thought, oh, I wrote this. And Kevin Spacey is saying it. He's so great in this scene. I really like the sort of the way he performs it. I like this bit in a second where when he really comes in to threaten Ansel, he makes a point of not looking at him. It's so beautifully passive-aggressive. I mean, is there a more brilliantly passive-aggressive actor than Kevin Spacey? But I love right here when he comes in and he like sort of starts threatening him. Then once he's said his bit, he looks off. I think this bit here, when in a second, this is it. He doesn't need to look at him anymore. He doesn't need to look at him to be threatening. So I love this. It's like no eye contact. Just I thought the photography in this bit was really great. It's also, we're shooting this on 35mm and anamorphic lenses, and you know, these focus points are really tough. They're really, really precise focus on these long lenses, but it looks beautiful. This was actually the restaurant that was written into the script. Bacchanalia is a real restaurant in Atlanta and a very good one. So that's where the restaurant scene was. And this is a valet for a different restaurant right around the corner. I think the other restaurant is called JTC. This is the Magica Cinema. One restaurant interior and a different restaurant valet. I'm sure this is blowing your minds. But both of them are nice restaurants, actually. So I highly recommend. But it's important to me to actually like write in real names of restaurants. You know, I think originally, funny enough, there was a moment during the sort of production of this, or pre-production, where we were going to go to New Orleans. And I had done a full rewrite of the movie for New Orleans, including changing all of the freeway names and the names of the restaurants. And then when Atlanta became the place, then I rewrote it again for Atlanta. And there was an Atlanta writer, Diallo Riddle, who lives in Los Angeles but is an Atlanta native. I gave him a list of questions. I said, what is the Atlanta equivalent of this? Or what is the Atlanta equivalent of that? And he was very helpful with me for that. So this scene was shot, we did 4 days of reshoots. We did 2 test screenings and then 4 days of reshoots. And this was an entirely new scene that we shot. Originally, there was a scene back in the restaurant, which was a very short version of the same thing. Ansel came back into the restaurant and said, and she said, "Is everything okay?" And he held her hand and looked at her and said, "It will be." So sort of same intention of the scene, but like, I think after we did these test screenings, which went well, you know, some people had sort of said, oh, they want to see a bit more between Ansel and Lily before the scene towards the end when he's like running away from the diner and she says, "I'm coming with you." So I had this idea, like, that what if he drops her off and she can just tell that something bad has happened because, you know, Spacey has just threatened his life and the lives of everybody that, you know, that he knows. So he's pushing her away and she doesn't want that and says, you know, like, I'm here for you when you're ready. And so, you know, showing them kissing for the first time, I think is important. This is Brogan Hall, who's playing Spacey's nephew, mysterious nephew, Sam. And this came from one of the ex-con interviews. Somebody, I think it was one of the British ex-cons that I spoke to, mentioned this thing which stuck with me immediately. He was talking about casing banks before a robbery, and he was saying about taking a son or a nephew in there to seem less suspicious, because if like a, you know, like a dude on his own is kind of like checking out a bank, that might look a bit suspicious. But if they got kids with them, it doesn't look suspicious. So these are the tiny things. Somebody mentions that in an interview, and that may be as much as they say about it, and I think, oh, there's a scene in that. And I've never seen that scene in something. So this idea of like Baby taking this kid in to look less suspicious and then having no idea how old the kid is or what his name is was you know, a great idea for a scene, and like always gets big laughs. And then the other key thing here, this is Alison King, who's playing the teller, who actually in the script, her literal character name is Nice Lady Teller. And the premise of this scene, which obviously pays off later, is Ansel's character, for the first half of the movie, has been adopting this see no evil, hear no evil approach, where he's fooling himself that he's not involved in crime. That's his sort of attitude at the start of the movie, is the earbuds in, sunglasses on, sitting at the back of class. You know, I'm a driver for this gang, but I'm not part of this gang. And I don't think maybe even Baby identifies himself as a criminal at the start of the movie. But a scene like this is important because he chit-chats with the teller, and she's really nice, and now he's put a face to it. So I think the thing is that for a lot of these people who are criminals, is they like are hypnotizing themselves to not think about the people or the consequences. Obviously, some of them are complete sociopaths who don't think about other people at all. But Baby I don't think is a sociopath, and I think sort of actually his connection with that teller is something that makes him do something very significant later, which is he saves her. He stops her going into the post office, and that then later has its own ramifications. But I think Baby is too good of a person and too good-hearted to let somebody that he's met and is identified as being like a warm, like sort of nice human being walk into a dangerous situation. I mean, obviously, it's something that like it comes to him in the moment because there are other people who are inside the bank, but I want to, you know, show you sort of like in the movie that you're seeing Baby's moral like sort of process as it's happening. He's young and he hasn't necessarily thought all of this through, or how he's going to extricate himself, or like what the consequences are. But when they present themselves to him, they're very binary decisions. Like, he's met that teller, so when he sees her later about to walk into a room that has an armed gunman in there, he shakes his head and says, "Don't go in." That's like an important moment. So to kind of have that buried in this otherwise funny scene with the nephew is like an important thing. This is Hal Whiteside playing the cook, who is just he only has a couple of lines in the whole thing, but like he's got such amazing presence and funny timing, and you know, that's one of those just great people that come out of the audition process that they just make you laugh with just a couple of. I think he maybe improvised the line sort of keep it short. Like we're trying to make, it's not like sort of it's not that Lily James is working in The Job from Hell, but I definitely tried to amp up the idea that the cook is like extremely brusque and grumpy, grouchy boss to have, and is probably like that with her every like 15 minutes. So when there's the opportunity to run away from this job, she doesn't really think twice about it. Really like that wide shot of Lily there. It's really really great. I was sort of inspired a little bit by I'm a big fan of Paul Thomas Anderson's Boogie Nights, and I seem to remember there was a shot in that near the start where Roller Girl was kind of framed in an otherwise completely sort of, maybe in a kitchen as well, but there was like a completely black wall. I remember when we were shooting that, and Baby's apartment, I said to Bill, like, let's not light the interior of this room, let's have it be a completely black frame. And I tried to compose it so that Baby's half and her half are like the sort of like the opposite composition, as he's like, you know, kind of far left and she's far right. That was sort of deliberate. Now, the funny thing about this is that Jamie Foxx says, "Do I look like a person who knows a fucking thing about Barbara fucking Streisand?" When in reality, Jamie Foxx is friends with Barbara Streisand. So that's a funny thing. I thought maybe he would have a problem saying that, but he didn't. And then I remember him talking to her about it. I said, "Do you think Barbara will like this film?" And this is what Jamie Foxx, verbatim response, which I think is amazing. I said, "Do you think Barbara will like the movie?" And Jamie said, "Have you met Barbara?" And I said, "No, I've never met Barbara Streisand." And Jamie replied, he goes, "She gangster." So, Barbara, if you watch the film, I do hope you enjoy. I am a big fan, and Jamie Foxx says you're a gangster, and I want to believe it. So I hope you enjoy the film if you see it. But that is actually a story. The thing about Barbara having tinnitus, Barbara Streisand having tinnitus, which a lot of music performers do have because they're on stage with like extremely loud sound systems. A lot of people in rock bands have tinnitus problems. That's something I read about when I was reading up on the condition, and I read about Barbara Streisand listening to music to drown out like her, sort of ongoing tinnitus from years of stage performance.
What you ladies listen to? Queen.
So, this is something. 2 bits here came from 2 different ex-con interviews. Like, there was one guy that I spoke to in London who said that he used to have a tape full of his killer tracks that he would drive around late at night. They'd steal cars and they'd drive around and sometimes get chased by the cops. And he said he had a tape with his killer track on it. I think that guy, who was in his 40s, this is about 10 years ago, so I guess he's in his 50s now. But he said he used to listen to a lot of rave music. Now, separately, through Joe Lawyer, I spoke to a guy in Boston, another ex-con, who had been involved in some armored car robberies. And he had this amazing story where he said about hex songs. I don't think he ever used the word hex songs himself, but he told this story very specifically. One of the questions that I would ask these ex-cons would be like their relationship to music. I would say, would you listen to music on the way to a job? And I think Joe Lawyer responded as Jamie does. He says, I would never listen to music on the way to a job. I've got enough demons making music up here. Which, when somebody says something like that, it's like, scribble it down. That's going in the screenplay. This other guy in Boston said this thing about him and this crew were going to do this job on a bank. And whilst they were about to go in, on the way to the bank, the radio started playing Guns N' Roses' cover of Knocking on Heaven's Door. And one of the members of the crew said that it was a jinx and it was a bad omen, and knocking on heaven's door meant that they were going to die and that they shouldn't do the job. And he was very, very insistent on it, and so they didn't go in, which I thought was like an amazing story. So of course that like got written into it as well. And Jamie then, when he was reading the script, we were talking about the hex songs, and Jamie said, my hex song is Hotel California by the Eagles. He said, because when I used to play pool in Dallas, I think he grew up near Dallas, Texas. He goes, when I used to play pool in Texas, if Hotel California came on, I would start losing. So that's my jinx song. That song's a jinx. So I wrote Hotel California into the script just to make Jamie laugh. Now, funny enough, this piece of music here, The Edge, which most people know through the Dr. Dre sample, is, on the next episode.
Did you get all that, baby?
Yeah.
Most people know from that, but that is actually a track by David McCallum and David Axelrod. Like, it's called The Edge, and it's like a jazz song from like the 60s. David McCallum, of course, is Ilya Kuryakin from the Man from U.N.C.L.E. TV series. So the fact that that piece of music is actually by Ilya Kuryakin, I always thought was kind of amazing. And that's The Edge. And then we sort of segue into Martha and the Vandellas. We shot endless, I think that's probably one of the last shots we did, White Lines on a Road. I think we shot that after Ansel Elgort's final shot in the movie, which was at the gas station coming up. We went back and did an extra shot, and then Ansel rapped, and then the rest of the crew got out on the road and just shot white lines, which is quite a hypnotic thing to do. I've shot white lines before. But like driving down the street, like with a camera fixed at the road, just like shooting the white lines is like a strangely hypnotic thing to do.
We're gonna go to Vegas. We'll put it all on red. We'll get married.
This was a scene that like, I think sometimes when people were watching the film, like the studio were sort of saying, oh, do we really need this scene? And it's like, well, this is a crucial scene to me because this is where you start to realize that like, Buddy and Darling, you already know that Bats is a bad guy. and you already know that Doc is a bad guy, and now you start to realize that there are no good guys in crime, that these two are like borderline psychotic as well, and have done some very bad things. And even though they're loved up and they love each other, and up until this point in the movie, John has been supportive and almost like fraternal to Baby, you also start to get the idea that these guys could be very nasty when cornered. And that was important. And this thing here, when you see that, like, you don't see what happened to the, you know, the guy behind the counter. So you don't really know whether he's dead or not. You don't see anything. But it's important for later that you set up that, like, bats will do anything. And obviously, like, later in the diner, that becomes an issue. This is a location called, I think it's called the Pullman Yard in Atlanta. And it's used a lot in movies. However, up until our movie, there was always this big train carriage right in the middle of the location. And I think pretty much any like sort of thriller shot in the last like 20 years features a scene here. So when we were shooting there, I said to the production manager, production designer and location manager, can we get rid of this train carriage? Because if we can get rid of this train carriage, you suddenly have this shot, this big wide, which no other film shooting here in the last like several years has got, because that train carriage has always been there. So we took out this massive train carriage and put it outside, and at some expense, but I just wanted to make this location ours.
Take this.
So this was shot, this tequila sequence was something that was like heavily designed, and I boarded the whole thing. I boarded the entire movie, but with something like this, I boarded the entire sequence, then did an animatic, then we shot it on video. Elsewhere on the Blu-ray, you'll be able to find this stuff. That's R. Marcos Taylor, who played Suge Knight in the Straight Outta Compton movie. He's also an MMA fighter as well.
Which reminds me, why the Mexican dude throw his wife off?
I thought I wanted to have him, somebody very distinctive, playing that part, because he comes back later, and I wanted you to remember him. It's important that you remembered him, and he wasn't like a faceless goon. So, now, here's our third Oscar winner, Mr. Paul Williams, the one, the only. If you don't know who Paul Williams is, you know, I'm a huge fan of his, and like both as a singer-songwriter and as an actor. So as an actor, like probably his biggest role is in Brian De Palma's Phantom of the Paradise, but then he also plays Little Enos in all three Smokey and the Bandits movies. He's also an Oscar-winning songwriter, because Paul has written songs for the Carpenters and Barbra Streisand and David Bowie, and he wrote the Muppet songs like Rainbow Connection and Moving Right Along, and the score for Muppets Christmas Carol, and the entire score for Bugsy Malone, which is one of my favourite musicals. And he also wrote all of the songs in Phantom of the Paradise as well. But yeah, this is the man. Paul Williams wrote We've Only Just Begun for the Carpenters and Rainy Days and Mondays. I mean, his list of credits is ridiculous. So, and also younger like viewers may know him from the Daft Punk album Random Access Memories, where he sings on two of the songs, including Touch. Jamie was particularly in awe of Paul Williams, because when I mentioned that Paul was in the movie, he said, singer-songwriter Paul Williams? So, and also I've known Paul for like 10 years. I met him 10 years ago when I did a double bill at the New Beverly in Los Angeles of Bugsy Malone and Phantom of the Paradise. And it was great to be able to say to Paul, I finally got a part for you. Now, that bit there with Jamie and miming smoking a cigar was something that Jamie was like rehearsing, and he was goofing around doing his choreography, and then he mimed like smoking a cigar, and I said, oh, you should do that in the shot. And he said, smoke a real cigar? And I said, no, you should just mime smoking a cigar, because it's hilarious and weird. Jamie also improv some of the bits here, like he improvs that thing about the fake ass Louis Vuitton hat, which when our costume designer Courtney Hoffman watched it for the first time, she howled with laughter that he said the fake ass Louis Vuitton hat. So in that little, you know, Jamie, probably out of all of the actors, I don't really allow that much improv on my movies, but Jamie came out with a couple of like killer improvs. and who am I to say no? They're like so funny, and it's funny. I like to plan everything. I'm very precise in the way that I write and shoot everything. And then sometimes there is happy accidents, so there's little moments of like magic. I'm usually like first to point out when something was like made up on the day, and we just made this up on the day. And I guess because it's like everything else is so planned that like it's always great to me when there's something that's like a bit of improv magic, and that thing with the phantom cigar always makes me laugh. Run the Jewels on the radio there. Obviously like from Atlanta, or at least Mike is. I'm not sure about LP, but like they're I think you could call them an Atlanta act. So it's great to have them featured in the movie.
So what's your real name, darling?
I like this idea as well, like that they've all got like sort of code names, which is something obviously that like is a big part of crime movies. You know, they're all working under sort of like nicknames, and it was something obviously with like Baby, Buddy, and Darling. You know, and Doc as well. I tried to find names that people would say anyway, because it's just like inherently amusing to sort of like, you know, like sort of like Jamie saying, well, hello, baby, you know, like sort of, or like Buddy, Darling, you know, Doc. I like the idea of having those, their real names, or like their nicknames at least, be like terms of affection that you would say for other people. It just like makes it ends up making a lot of the dialogue sound like song titles. That was the idea, and you know, straight away now we've got a song called like When Something Is Wrong With My Baby. There was always the idea of using his name being Baby, because in a lot of our gangster films you have, and in real life gangsters, Babyface Nelson was a real guy, and that's a real thing in gangster movies, is Babyface. Like the young kid, like sort of like the kid who looks kind of too young to be in the gang. So to take that, but also have like Baby being the most used name in songs, I thought was interesting. And a lot of the time, you know, the majority of songs are talking about a woman when they're talking about Baby. Not all of them, but like I just like the idea of like him having a name that's like sort of like synonymous with so many pop songs. This is, a lot of people say this is one of their favorite scenes in the movie, and it's a really significant scene, and also like a great scene for like this combination of the cast. There's not another scene in the movie where like Lily has a scene with Jamie Foxx, or Asa for that matter. So it was actually great. I think we shot this in 2 days, this whole sequence. But I remember it being a particularly kind of great night, because obviously it's like a meaty dialogue scene. Jamie is really on fire in this scene. Well, they all are. Aza's great as well. I mean, I also like as well that John, at a certain point in this scene, actually coming up right now, John Hamm doesn't say another word, but you know that like sort of like a black mood has descended, and like John like is, you know, getting into his kind of like and dead eyes, killer instinct phase. But Jamie is so great in this scene. I think Lily's responses are amazing. And obviously there's a big moment for Asa as well. It's her kind of like big monologue. And interesting, and actually if you watch closely, Ansel in the background has already, you know, a lot of those diners have crayons where like for kids to draw stuff. If you look earlier in the scene, whilst these guys are all like getting in each other's faces, Ansel has quietly taken the napkin out and written the message that he gives to Deborah. That's already happened. So, you know, like Asa does a great job with this dialogue here. And then Jamie improvised. It was always written into the script that like bats broke into applause. But then Jamie completely improvised the line, that's some Oscar shit right there. And did you rehearse that? I just thought it was really funny. And I think he only said it once. And I said to Jamie, I said, oh, that's definitely going in the movie. The idea of an actual Oscar winner saying within a movie to somebody else, that's some Oscar shit right there. I thought it was really funny. So, you know, funny, but also still terrifying. I think sort of like, I particularly love this stuff coming up here. Now, funny enough, when I shot this and wrote this, John Hamm, or Buddy, was supposed to be like gripping his fork. So you got the idea that Buddy is maybe about to stab Jamie. And actually, if you see in the wide shots, you can see that he's holding his fork. And I shot all those extra inserts where John is gripping the fork and, you know, then eventually lets go of it. It's all bent. And then I got to say, the acting was so good in the scene, I just didn't need it. It was just overcomplicating it. But if you look in some of the shots, you can see that John was like gripping a fork at one point, like he's going to stab Jamie. I really love this big pause. This is one of my... It's a great shot of everybody. And Ansel's reaction is great. I also like Ansel's reaction when Jamie says Deborah, and like Ansel realizes that you know, she's wearing her name tag for the first time in the movie.
Okay. I'll make sure you tip the nice lady.
Just having a little sip of coffee. I think that's the first time I've not stopped talking for about an hour and 10 minutes straight. I really like this scene. And actually, this is another scene where the scene ran long. Not long, but like longer than the original song. So originally it was just the Sam and Dave song written into the script. And as we were editing the scene, realized that like, oh, he's still got like another 90 seconds at the end of this. So this is one of those times in the edit where I found an extra song. And I think I literally, I don't want to give iTunes too many plugs, especially on a Sony movie. But on iTunes, I had the original song "When Something Is Wrong with My Baby" by Sam and Dave, and I went onto the Genius thing, and I pressed the Genius button next to that song, and like found another like 100 songs that were in my record collection, so I already had them. And I maybe like 7 down from there was "Every Little Bit Hurts" by Brenda Holloway. And so in the edit, me and Paul Matchless, the editor, were like lining up songs, and then we lined up that one, and just like the lyrics worked perfectly. So that's one of those little bits of serendipity. It's just like something that was not planned for a movie that was very pre-planned in terms of, you know, we cleared all the songs before we started shooting, and we did all the storyboards, and everything's worked out. And then there's something like, we have like a gap here, and it feels like it needs another song. What's it going to be? And then you have to go past the clearance person and say, hey, we need another song. Because obviously you can imagine the music budget was tight and ambitious. This little section here is actually where we start to get into more of Steve Price's score. Because it felt at this point after the diner that there are some stretches here where even if Baby is listening to music, we as an audience are not party to it. It becomes more about the tensions in the rest of the group. So originally I've had this like found soundtrack by somebody called The Ugly American that was called 3 Trains. And it was just kind of the sounds of trains. And we didn't use that track, but sort of when Steve was doing the score, it was this idea of bringing in like the rhythms of things that would be in the room, like the sound of trains nearby, but also this ticking clock. You know, Ansel's already said to... it's funny, I keep going between Ansel and Baby and Lily and Deborah, but maybe that's because they're so like close to the character, so synonymous in my head. But Baby has said to Deborah, like, sort of, I'm going to road trip at 2 a.m, so he's looking at the clock. So this section of music here, I think, by Steve Price is great, because it encompasses, like, the sound of, like, trains on the tracks and the ticking clock. And I really like the way that it works, especially how it works into this dream sequence. Now, interestingly enough, the first draft of the script ended with a sequence that was basically like this and like the end of the movie, but it was started as a contemporary flashback and then ended as a 50s flashback. So literally the end scene of the movie in the first draft was Baby gets out of prison and it's in modern day. And then as he crosses over to get in the car, he's suddenly in 50s gear and so is she. So it's like clearly a dream. And Tom Rothman at Sony, when he was very excited about doing the movie, and he said, I only have 2 notes. I cannot remember what the first note was. But one of the notes, one of his big deal breakers, And I understand what he's saying is he said, you cannot end on a dream sequence. He said, you cannot do that, like, sort of, not in this movie. I think it's not, like, right. So I thought about it, and it was very sort of important to me to kind of have the sense of that. So then it changed as I thought, well, what if I had this 50s thing earlier? Is this his dream of what he wants to be? Is that, Baby is this kid who's slightly out of time, who's hanging around in these 50s diners, like, full of Americana, and with this, girl that he's fallen in love with who's, like, dressed in this, like, 50s waitress's outfit. Which, it's always something I've always thought is interesting about America itself, is you have these chains like Johnny Rockets and Ed DeBevick and, Mel's Diner that are, like, keeping this spirit of, like, 50s Americana alive. And if you've ever, like, driven down Route 66, every other diner is 50s style. And I always thought it was an interesting thing of what young people must think about that. And I thought Baby is quite a sort of a romantic dreamer, that he might sort of be dreaming of, like, a different time and would rather be back in, like, a sort of more innocent time of, like, cars and music. So I rewrote the script. I put that black and white flashback earlier, and then the ending basically sort of, like, mirrors that, so it becomes, like, literally a dream come true. We can talk about the actual ending later, but that was the idea of putting that earlier. It wasn't originally like that. But in a way, like, not to compare this movie to Blade Runner, because it's nothing like it. In Blade Runner, you have, like, the unicorn dream, and then later, like, you see, like, the foil unicorn, and that's, like, a key thing. And I thought, well, maybe if you've seen this 50s dream, and then when it appears to come true at the end, that's kind of significant in terms of, what he's been dreaming about comes true in some form.
That's one fucking dumbass excuse.
I really like this section here because I always wanted to have a sequence that revolved around Baby making music, and some of my friends and artists include people like Kid Koala, Eric San, Kid Koala, and a guy called Mark Nicholson, who's DJ nom de plume is Ozzy Miso. Now, both of them helped me out, like, early on in the movie. Mark Nicholson helped me put together these mixes of the songs with sound effects in them. And then Kid Koala, he made this song that they have to play back. The song that you saw Ansel, like, recording and performing earlier. I love this idea of, like, to prove his innocence, he has to play this goofy mashup. Because usually in a movie, if somebody is recording criminals, it means they're an undercover cop. It's like they're Donnie Brasco or something. They're wearing a wire, and it's something that's extremely treasonous to do if you're in a gang and you've been recording people talking. So I loved, when I came up with the idea for this scene, I just loved the idea that his get out is to play this dumb track, and have to play it to the criminals to prove his innocence. So it was always something that I was very kind of keen on, this idea, and it's always very pleasing to me that everybody laughs at this scene. The other thing is that we did actually have this song done by the time we shot the scene, so these actors were actually listening to it. So it's funny for, like, to actually shoot a shot of Kevin Spacey, like, listening to his his voice being included in this silly dance mashup.
He can't say nothing.
Yeah, but he can read motherfucking...
I think Ansel is really great in these scenes, because now the character is
Doc, I'm available. I can take
forced to speak up and stand up for himself. For a character that, like, intentionally and sometimes unintentionally has been a very passive character, somebody who is trying to literally blend into the walls, is now having to fight for his life and protest his innocence and stand up to these guys. Oh, this is a very rare scene. This shot right here, I hardly ever do this, but this is a scene that I improvised on the day. It was not scheduled, it was not storyboarded, and it was not in the script. But very rare occurrence that actually we were, like, ahead of ourselves on that day. And I thought, I was probably right. I thought that if I didn't shoot a shot of Lily being stood up, that somebody at the studio would say, Where's Lily James at this point? How can we track Lily? Deborah. So I think to the amazement of my AD and my producers, I said, oh, I've got a new scene that I want to do. And it's in the movie, and it is an important scene because you need to, I think you really care about Deborah in this movie, and it's really important that you're tracking her. This section here, actually, if you find in the deleted scenes, there was a scene that I was always very fond of that we ended up cutting out of the movie just for like pacing and like, you know, tonal flow that like happened just before this. But this scene here was something that was like always very, very early on, was a scene and a song that I'd thought about. This is a song by Blur called Intermission, and I always like the way that it starts very slowly and very sort of like regimented, and then the pace keeps building up, and it sounds like something terrible is going to happen. It's got a very sinister, like, escalating melody to it. So this whole idea of like the guy waiting outside, and then I think originally in the first draft I didn't have the teller in there. That's something that came later that was like a great idea of bringing it all together. Him seeing the teller and her saying no. Now, why is she not there at 9 a.m. in the morning? Maybe she had to go to the doctor's. We don't know, but that's not important. She had to go to CVS or something. But this idea of like the security guard coming out and Ansel not knowing what to do. This is Joe Lawyer, by the way. So that's Joe Lawyer, who's now a writer and but is an ex-con, and he was my technical advisor on this movie, playing that security guard who just got shot by a bank robber in an amazing moment of irony. I think, you know, then he had to lie on the floor covered in blood for like sort of half the day. This was always a bit like sort of a very early idea of Baby taking out one of the other crew members who's a threat to him. Like knowing what Jamie has done in like, or rather Bats has done in the train yard and in the diner and at the gas station. Ansel is not about to be on the receiving end of that shotgun. So I really love the idea of like sort of, it becomes a game of dominoes at this point. Is like, whether you choose to think of it as an accident or if it's done with like criminal intent, like Baby has basically killed Bats. If you look closely, you can see that Baby switches off the passenger airbag just before he hits the accelerator. So it's definitely done with intent to like take out that crew member. But unfortunately then, the problem is he's now left the rest of the crew in the lurch. Which, at this point here, there is no love lost between Buddy and Baby. As far as like Buddy's concerned, Baby is a dead man because he's jeopardized the mission and he's left them all in danger. This is also one of my favorite sequences here because it was something that I always wanted to do, a foot chase, and I thought it'd be great to have a movie that you think is a car chase movie and to suddenly explode into a foot chase, and have an actor, you know, a 6'4" actor who has been sat down in a car for most of the movie, suddenly like let rip and be really physical, and also they're desperate to get out of it, and like sort of shows his kind of like intuition and ingenuity outside of the car. It was really important. I love foot chases generally, and you know, I've done some foot chases before in Hot Fuzz. You know, some of my favorite sequences in movies are foot chases, be it Point Break or Raising Arizona, or even Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So the idea of doing a big foot chase in this was exciting to me. It was always one, though, I had to justify doing it. Like, whenever, you know, when you're in the process of putting a movie together, there's always budget questions, always looking to cut pages, and throughout the entire pre-production and the production itself, I was always getting pressure from the studio to cut the foot chase out. And I think eventually I ended up deferring some of my fee to pay for the couple of days to do this foot chase, and I'm very glad I did because it's one of my proudest moments. That was my PA, Rich Starzak, on the left, very, very briefly. And also, I mean, a lot of people ask, watching this sequence, is like, is this Ansel Elgort doing the stunts? And the truth is, he is doing a lot of it, and then some shots are by an amazing parkour person, Paul Darnell, who Brad Allen recommended to me, an amazing stunt double. But Ansel does do some of the stunts, like he does this one, jumping through a minivan, which we shot. The movie is on 35mm, but a couple of these shots are on a thing called the Minicam, which is a digital camera. And in fact, that shot where Ansel is, jumps through the minivan, the tiny camera is on a pole, and you basically like pull through the car with him. This is actually free driving in these sequences, though. It's not on a car rig. He's driving through this thing and smashing into things, and I think he actually, in that bit just prior to that, he did actually like reverse into that other car, like, which was driven by a stunt driver, but still, if the crash looks real, is because he actually did it. And this is all in an area called the Gulch, right in the middle of Atlanta. You can see like the sort of the Georgia Dome in the background, and CNN is right around the corner as well. It's also right by Atlanta's FBI building, and you have to be extremely clear about the times when you are shooting guns on these locations, because you have to obviously let the police know when there are guns going off. We did actually there's a guy called Chris Beanland, who is ex-police, that was him right there. He just got shot. He was our like sort of advisor on the movie. He's like an ex-policeman who now like sort of kind of assists kind of like film crews, but he got to do his cameo. So he was the guy back there who said, "Put down your weapon." Is Chris Beanland, an ex-Atlanta officer. This again was always one of the very earliest ideas in the movie, that he's now without music, he's holding like his own pulse for some kind of internal rhythm, and then the idea of having to carjack this nice lady, played by Andrea Fry. I was one of the earliest ideas was like sort of he carjacks a car and then finds the right kind of like sort of channel and then scoots off. Now, in the script, I think it just had him saying, "I'm so sorry," but I want to say it was either Darren Prescott or Jeremy Fry's idea for him to do the drift and then throw the purse back. So all credit to them for this thing, because it's like really important that like, you show that he's a good kid at heart because he throws this old lady her bag back. Look very closely in the background. You see like an advert for Boost. I thought it'd be funny that as he's like boosting a car, you can actually see an advert for Boost in the background. There's a couple of other ones in the movie like that earlier. There's, I think you see Sprint during the foot chase. I wanted to do more of those, but not a lot of companies will let you use their brands in a film with lots of criminal activity. If you look very closely on the floor here, you can see pretty much every album that is featured in the movie. Queen, Blur, T-Rex, Detroit Emeralds, Blues Explosion, Focus, Simon & Garfunkel. Because we had all of those album covers cleared, it was always my idea, is I think, well, maybe I specifically, and probably looked like a madman to the crew, I was like laying out all the albums on the floor so you could see them. I think both Ansel and CJ are so great in this scene. I love doing these scenes where there's like sort of, I think something that's different about this movie from some of the previous ones is that I think a lot of the characters are very sincere. I don't think there's a moment of like archness or cynicism from like Ansel or CJ or Lily, and I think it has like gives the film a very different tone to some of my previous stuff. Not to say that my other movies are not emotional. I think particularly Shaun of the Dead and World's End are sort of very personal and emotional. But I really enjoyed doing these scenes with Ansel and CJ. I think it shows in the performances that Ansel was incredibly fond of CJ as a person and as a performer. And, Ansel learnt all the sign language and would talk to like CJ and like sort of the sign language that he'd learned. And this scene particularly, I think Ansel is great in this scene, and I think it's because genuinely fond of CJ, and I have a feeling this is maybe one of CJ's last scenes. It's always emotional shooting somebody's final scene in a movie where you're actually saying goodbye to the character and the performer. So it was interesting doing this, and it's very hypnotic just watching like actors sign and not speak. I love doing these scenes, and you're working with like 2 interpreters on set as well. But it's I don't know, it's a really sort of beautiful thing. I really enjoy doing these scenes. I love CJ Jones. It's fantastic. I'm really, really glad we cast him. This was actually not a retirement home, but it is a golf club. I guess those are the same thing. I can't remember the name of the golf club, but somewhere out in the middle of, not in Atlanta itself, in Duluth, maybe like 30 miles away from Atlanta. Sugarloaf Club Drive is where it was. The Sugarloaf Club. It sounds fancy. It is pretty fancy. Now, this is back at the diner. This is Barry White. So this is a good example of like a scene and a shot, this Steadicam shot here, where like a lot of the movie, Ansel is listening to it on his headphones. He's opening the doors on the beat, and it's all set to music, and all of the actors in the scene can hear this. This again is one of the songs that I had the idea for this before I'd started writing. I like the idea that Barry White's vocals and lyrics are eventually commentating on the action. So the idea that the song is playing and then the 2 things sync up, and then there's a sort of the final part of it. Buddy takes the earphones and puts them in, and you hear the lyric, "I'm never ever gonna quit," which is like a foreshadowing of like how tenaciously indestructible John Hamm is going to be.
She a good girl? You love her?
This is also, funny enough, given like how like ragged he is, and it was kind of tough for John. This was John's first day of shooting, believe it or not. Just the way that we had to sort of schedule some of this stuff, which is not ideal for an actor to kind of start with his once he's unraveled. But I love John in this scene. I mean, they're all great in this scene, but I like sort of just how it's this bit in a second where John smiles at the cop, who does this really dry, fakey smile right here whilst he's got a gun at him, and then he goes, that. It's great. I think, John is actually the actor in the whole movie who is the only member of cast, aside from Paul Williams, who I knew before the shoot. Everybody else I met through the production of the movie, but John I've known for since 2008. I met John during his first ever SNL hosting gig. I happened to be there that night, and I met him at the after party. And when I started writing the film, I wrote it with John Hamm in mind. And then in 2012, once I'd finished the draft, and before I went to London to make The World's End, we did a read-through working title in Beverly Hills. And around the table were a bunch of actors reading several parts, and the only person who's still playing the same part was John Hamm. So I'm very pleased, having been friends with him for nearly 10 years, that we finally got a chance to work together, and I think he's fantastic in this movie. He's got his scary haircut, which people find either by turns sexy and sinister. Somebody said to me the other day that it's got an alt-right look to it, which was not intentional at the time, but I think that guy Richard Spencer has since claimed this particular haircut, and John ends up being the ultimate baddie, so that maybe says everything. Let's not get too political, we'll leave it there. As you see, this diner was right by a motel, so there's this motel right around the corner from this diner, and I think that night we had to hire out lots of the rooms because we were filming right into the evening.
Who?
Yeah, this was I think originally in the first draft of the script, Buddy turned up in the final set piece driving just another Charger that he'd stolen. And it wasn't until I started driving around Atlanta location scouting that I noticed that Atlanta, Georgia, and I know this isn't the way you're supposed to think about the police, but Atlanta, Georgia, in the city, they have these badass, Dodge Charger police vehicles that are in the movie. navy blue with that red stripe.
I just need one thing.
And I know this isn't the intention with police cars, but I couldn't help thinking, wow, those police cars look really, really cool. So I thought, then that gave me the idea is that, like, Buddy steals that police car. So Buddy ends up, and that, I think, adds extra suspense to the start of the sequence. Now, we should talk about Sydney and Thurman, the ATL twins here. These guys are sort of Atlanta celebrities. You might know them from the Vice documentary that's online about them. I first saw them in Harmony Korine Spring Breakers, and I don't think it's saying anything incorrect to say that Sydney and Thurman are a complete trip to work with. And I will say this as well, like, I loved working with them. They are the authentic article. They're artists as well. They're artists, and they also work as paralegals. But they're amazing people, and they improvise one of the great lines in the movie. I have to give them credit. The line, more like Bonnie and Bonnie, is theirs. In the script, it just said, check out Bonnie and Clyde. And then Sydney or Thurman, I couldn't tell you which right now, said more like Bonnie and Bonnie. So, guys, I thank you for that improv. I know you wanted to improv more, but I basically, you came out with an absolute killer zinger that is in the movie, and I will take credit for it for the rest of my life. But I thought I'd say on record here that it was your idea, Bonnie and Bonnie, and thank you for that one.
I'm not giving you those.
Yeah, they are a trip, and I love them dearly, so I'm very pleased that they're in the movie. But if you haven't seen Spring Breakers, you can check them out in that film, and they're fantastic.
Congratulations. Then you only have
I like in this scene here, it was something that just came up on the day of giving Kevin some business to have. I like the idea that he's packing away the toy cars very sort of fastidiously. I mean, the idea here is that with this location itself, I sort of had the idea that the Doc, you don't know much about him, but my idea and what I said to Kevin is I felt like Doc has another job. Like, he works in the garment industry, and maybe he's like a self-made man in a completely different industry, or that he started in crime and then had a legitimate industry in the garment, sort of field.
Let's go.
But he does, like, robberies on the side just for, like, extra cash and for the thrill of it. And at this point in the movie, now that everything's gone to shit, like, Doc is packing up shop. So that was the idea here as he comes back. In the first draft of the script, the very first script, there wasn't this scene with them at all. I think sort of Baby rang Doc, and then whilst Baby was on the phone to Doc, Buddy was already at the warehouse and then killed Doc himself. Later, all of this stuff came into it, which sort of through the script development process and through speaking to other writers who were giving me ideas of how to make it more dramatic, including my good friend Michael Bacall. Like, some of this ideas of how to sort of amp up the drama came to it. I think even this scene here actually was partly reshot after we test screened it. That dialogue was in there, but I added the line, I was in love once. Kevin's original take was sort of a lot colder, and to sort of set up this change of heart here, I had him redo the elevator dialogue. Originally, there was another part to it where after he gets run down by this car, he's on the floor and he's dying, and he throws in the keys himself and repeats the Monsters Inc. line one more time. But once we start test screening it, it just felt like his death was becoming elongated. So we did some changes to this, like sort of, basically this scene was like this in the original version, and then things like John saying, "Here it is, baby, you'll kill a track," was a little pickup. Yeah, originally Kevin had a little bit of dialogue here, but it just seemed like a bit too fanciful that he'd survive that car wreck as well. There goes Kevin for a second time. I realize, Kevin, if you're watching, I realize this is, you being reversed over has ruined your chances of being in a sequel, and I apologize for that. This Brighton Rock was always the one and only song I had in mind for this sequence, and it's an album track by Queen from Sheer Heart Attack, which I think is my favorite Queen album. It has such a killer guitar solo by Brian May that I felt like it was a Queen song that needed to be more famous. But this scene went through a lot of iterations, both in the writing and the design, and even through the pickups and stuff, to kind of make it flow and work better. And a little bit of action coming up that we cut out that was really nice, but like, you know, when you're doing test screenings and stuff with an audience, you sort of, you know, you find out how much car action an audience can take, you know. But some of these things here was, you know, we added in extra parts to it. For example, this little bit here where John comes around the corner and smashes into these cars, right here, that was shot on a reshoot. Because we wanted to show something physically that helped Ansel and Lily get ahead of themselves. It was also the idea of having that bullfighting clip earlier in the movie where he's watching the bullfighting documentary. Is Ansel realizes that, like a bullfighter, is you can't just keep running away. You have to kind of like get out on foot and sort of defeat the beast. So in a way, the idea with this is like, Baby is like a bullfighter now. He's now tricking, like, John. So it's like, this is like a bullfighter thing. It's like distracting him and then, like, you know, sort of taking him out. And sort of, you know, like being in one place and then the other. I like this idea of him kind of like ghosting around, like he suddenly can just be in any different car at any point. And he's magically like breaking into different cars. This is Elijah Everett playing the security guard. Funny enough, it was he didn't have a line before, and then when I was in the edit, I thought, he should have said, "Are you okay, buddy?" Not knowing that his name's Buddy. So when we came back to do the reshoots, I got him back into like ADR that line. Originally, I had like in the test screenings, I had done the line for him, and I thought, terrible thing if it was like your first time in a movie and then somebody else had done your voice. So I said, come back in and do this line because somebody else can't take your one line out of it. I always like the lighting in this. I like the idea that some of those police cars do have like emergency lighting in them, but it's just a way of making like John look utterly demonic in the end. And also for a movie where it's been so natural, like just making the whole thing feel a bit more expressionistic in the end. You know, like it's got a bit of a Mario Bava, Dario Argento vibe about it all of a sudden, just making the colours very bright and very expressionistic. Just to really give you this sense of like, you know, a hellish finale. Now, we actually added, this bit was always in there.
You did good, kid.
This idea was always in there, right from the very first draft of the script, that Buddy deafens Baby and leaves him deaf. In the first draft of the script, Deborah was not even in this scene. That kind of came later. And Baby had to sort of escape, sort of deafened. But I like the idea that it's like sort of Buddy's plan, which is utterly like sort of vindictive and nefarious, is to deafen Baby, murder Deborah, and then just leave Baby for dead, and like sort of just leave him with like, you did this is your dead girlfriend. And so this little bit here was actually part of the pickup, because originally I'd shot it in a much more enigmatic, Hitchcocky way, where like Deborah, it was all from Baby's point of view, and Deborah runs up and hits Buddy, and then that's it. But test screening audiences, some people were like, oh, is Buddy unconscious? Is he dead? So my answer to that was to really show John dying, sort of like really put a full stop on it and show him dying and then blowing up. So he really is toast. I thought that was kind of important. It was also something as well to sort of give Lily a little bit more action to do, to show her like sort of hitting John. Just shoot that action better and have her become engaged in the action, and Baby, like, you know, the two of them take out Buddy as teamwork together. I didn't want Baby to solely save Deborah. It was very important that Deborah does something really wildly brave to sort of run out and try and take out this gunman, which is something that, like, I would not be able to do. I would be still sitting in that car frozen with fear. This idea of, again, sort of came through, I think sort of doing some research about deaf people, and also probably through that Musicophilia book, the thing of like people listening to the vibrations of music, you know, which you see Joe do earlier in the movie. And in fact, CJ himself would be able to completely tap his foot to the rhythm of what we were playing, even though he's deaf, just because he could feel the rhythm of it in the room. And so you see that shot of Joe earlier holding the speaker, and then the idea that later that Baby is like can hear the Easy song by holding the speaker. This is very important in this scene. They have to remember that anything Lily says, Ansel has to be looking at her, because otherwise, if his hearing's impaired at this point, he won't hear her. This thing of him giving himself up was there right from the start of the first draft. And I think for some people who, first watched the movie, or even like when making the movie, was like, oh, why don't they just get away with it? Just drive off into the sunset. And my answer to that is also, having seen a lot of these movies, and especially these movies where there's the happy ending, in inverted commas, where they drive off into the sunset, my thought, especially with this movie, is that Lily James's character has only been involved in the crime like 6 hours before. She wasn't anything to do with this until, the diner scene. And so I think Ansel feels like the moral responsibility to give himself up and do the time so she doesn't have to. It's like his fault and not hers. And so why should she be a fugitive for the rest of her life? She hasn't really done anything. I mean, she has technically been aiding and abetting a criminal, but my idea is that Ansel takes the rap for everything here, and maybe even has to pretend that Deborah is a hostage to do that. But that was the idea with this sequence. Is I love the idea. I'm a really big fan of the old Warner Brothers gangster films, which always had a real moral kicker at the end of them, especially Angels with Dirty Faces, which I think has one of the best endings in crime films. So I like this idea that sort of Baby does something that you hardly ever see somebody do in a crime film, is take responsibility for his own actions and give himself up. And with the idea that he could do the time, come out a better man, and then actually be with somebody without having to lie to them. Of course, if we ever did a sequel, it's not as easy as that, but that's his intention at the time, is do the time for the bad things that he's done. And you see here that, all the corroborating character witnesses of the teller and the lady that he carjacked, and Joe, of course, and Deborah herself. Now, ironically enough, this sequence was all supposed to be silent originally, and we wrote the dialogue. In fact, I wrote this, what you call B dialogue, with we got a real judge to give us some dialogue, and also with my PA, Rich, we wrote that B dialogue basically for lip readers, because if you're doing something silently.
It's funny.
Oh, I should mention that's John Spencer there. John Spencer from the Blues Explosion plays the prison guard, so he essentially tops and tails the movie. But anyway, to go back to that silent stuff, it was never intended to be in the film, but we wrote it all because people out there who can lip read can tell what they're saying. So then later, after the first test screening, I tried something as an experiment, which, really worked for the audience, where you actually can hear what they're saying. So that's where that stuff came from. So it was never originally in the screenplay.
All my love.
So interesting enough, this last scene here, as we lead up to Baby Driver, in the first cut of the movie, this was all in color, and the rainbow in it was in the final shot of the movie. We had an extra crane shot. Really, when it was all in color, some people argued about, there's the rainbow that pays off the Dolly Parton quote in the post office. Everybody wants sunshine, nobody wants rain, but you... everybody wants sunshine, nobody wants rain, but you can't have a rainbow without a little rain. Oh, no. Everybody wants sunshine. No, wait, okay, let me back up. Apologies to Dolly Parton. Just screwed up the ending of my movie. Everybody wants happiness, nobody wants pain, but you can't have a rainbow without a little rain. So the idea is that Baby has been through all of that and been through prison, and the rainbow at the end of it is Deborah herself. That's the idea with that. Interesting enough, originally with that ending, it was all in color. And when we shot it all in color to a test screening, there were more arguments about whether it was real or not. So then, strangely enough, I thought, well, if you made it go from black and white into color, it literally turns from his dream into a reality. Now, I leave it up to the audience whether they want to interpret that end scene as something that's actually happening after 5 years, or his dream of what will happen. And, you know, I know what I think it is, because I wrote it. But, you know, when you show it to an audience or people that you know, and they say, I want to believe that that's real at the end, who am I to say that they're wrong? I think one of the nice things about a movie is if you can interpret the ending how you see fit. So maybe if we ever do a sequel, we'll answer that more definitively. But that's basically the idea with the ending. And it was interesting to me that the audience bought the ending more and liked the ending more when it became more expressionistic, which usually with like studio test screening process is not the way that it goes. I should point out as well that both of those prisons, both the interior and the exterior, are both working prisons. And so that whole end sequence where Hansel's in prison is in a working prison, which is an amazing thing to do, to shoot in a working prison, because, you know, the cast and the crew are in one section, and, you know, you're like locked off as like, you can be, you know, you had to go into the kitchen area and, you know, have guards kind of like blocking kind of where that would intersect with the actual working parts of the prison, or everybody's locked up, or actually, you know, shooting scenes walking down hallways where there are prisoners on the other side is quite a humbling experience. I should say as well, I deliberately made them wear white jumpsuits at the end because I've become tired of the orange jumpsuits, which in reality, it's orange jumpsuits if you're a new offender, and blue kind of like uniform if you're a veteran prisoner. But I always liked the white jumpsuits in Sam Peckinpah's The Getaway. And I decided that it would be nice to kind of like use the old white jumpsuits again. If you look at his prison number, Baby's prison number is actually the release date of The Driver. So that's what those numbers mean. It's like something July 1978. There is an idea actually with this movie. I like when sort of movies feel like they could be the spiritual sequel to something. So you could say that this movie ends and The Getaway starts, or you could say that like this movie ends and The Driver starts. I always felt that Sam Peckinpah's The Driver leads directly into William Friedkin's The Sorcerer. So if you want to stick on another Blu-ray right after this, I recommend one of those I just mentioned. Thank you for listening, and it's always a pleasure, and I love you all very dearly. Good night.
Was he slow? Was he slow?
Was he slow?